that I must confess that I believe quite firmly that an inductive knowledge of a great number of things in the future is becoming a human possibility. I believe that the time is drawing near when it will be possible to suggest a systematic exploration of the future. So, science fiction has actually had a great role in science over the years. You can argue quite easily that the science fiction has predicted many things that go on in science now. And even you can start to think about how science fiction has actually inspired scientists in what they choose to study. I quite regularly find myself in meetings that I call Star Trek meetings. These are meetings where I'm sat with other scientists, and we're supposed to think, if there are no holds barred, nothing, just think whatever you like. What would you try to do? And without fail, we come up with something which has been in an episode of Star Trek at some point, every single time. The first point we have to start off with is an understanding of what nanotechnology is, okay? If we're working at the nanoscale, we need to know what nanotechnology is. So nanotechnology has been defined by the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering, and they've defined nanotechnology and indeed nanoscience in rather dry statements, but we are scientists after all, so we need our definitions. Nanotechnology, or nanotechnologies, are the design, characterization, production, and application of structures, devices, and systems by controlling shape and size at the nanometer scale. And nanoscience is essentially the same thing, but without all the application side of it, right? So nanoscience is just the science of studying things at that level. So we need to know how big is the nanoscale, right? The nanoscale, we all know what a nanometer is. A nanometer is 10 to the minus 9 meters, or it's a millionth of a millimeter, right? Now, I work at this kind of level all the time. I can't visualize what a millionth of a millimeter is. Most people here are now thinking about a ruler, okay, and thinking about that small thing, and they're saying, well, if we divide that 1,000,000 times, okay, that's correct. But it's very, very difficult to visualize what a nanometer actually is. So we're going to work towards this. So the first thing I want you to do is to look at the person next to you or the person in front of you and look at their hair and look at one of their hairs. Okay. Now we use the width of a hair or a hair's breadth as a measure of two things which are extremely close to each other. So things are divided by a hair's breadth, right? A hair's breadth is huge on the nanoscale. A human hair is 80,000 nanometers across. These are massive objects, okay? And yet we use, in common language, we use that as a measure of something really small, and it really isn't. So, red blood cells, okay? Next thing we want to go to, red blood cells, 7,000 nanometers in size. Also huge, huge, great object, right? So we need to go smaller still. Where you start to get to what is viewed as the nanoscale is below 100 nanometers. So if we have an object which is 100 nanometers in size, then everything smaller than that is on the nanoscale. So the AIDS virus is 100 nanometers across. Okay, that's your measure. Everything which is smaller than a virus is on the nanoscale. And if we really want to get down to the nanoscale, where we're talking about 1 nanometer or 2 nanometers, we're talking about molecules. So actually, you're down here. So DNA, we have a model of it here. DNA is 2 nanometers in diameter. Most molecules are approximately 1 nanometer in dimensions. If you have a favorite molecule, okay, I know some of you will, those molecules are a nanometer in size. And that's the benchmark we're talking about. We're talking about the molecular scale. And if we think about the history of computing, then we can start to think about some of the issues which arise. So this is widely acknowledged as the first computers, Charles Babbage's difference engine, which is, or a replica thereof, is in the Science Museum, not too far from here. And this is obviously the starting point. This could perform relatively simple arithmetic calculations, right? But it's a pretty big thing. Computers then proceeded to get bigger and bigger and bigger. and the older members of the audience will remember computers which were just ridiculous and absolutely huge. So this is a computer which is operated on what are called valves, right? I don't really remember valves myself, to be quite honest. But this is a computer, and computers started to fill entire rooms. That's kind of interesting. And then, of course, and there's, I don't know whether it's an apocryphal story or not, but at some point it was considered that we would only need one computer, right? Clearly, computing has changed since then. And actually, part of this has been acknowledged by something called Moore's Law. Moore's Law is named after Gordon Moore. And Gordon Moore is one of the founders of Intel. So Intel are one of the companies who make your little computer chips, okay, which are in whatever devices you happen to have. And he's one of the founders of Intel. And therefore, he's relatively well off, should we say. You should invite him over for a lecture. It's an extraordinary kind of individual. And in 1975, he came up with what is called Moore's Law. Moore's Law isn't a law, okay? It's basically a prediction. And what he said was the number of transistors incorporated into a computer chip will approximately double every 24 months. Right? So every 24 months, the number of computer chips we can get into a computer chip will double. And this is the line, okay, with versus time, okay, versus a year. And the man was right, okay? Really kind of interesting. 1975, he predicted that this would happen, and it did happen. And we're still pretty much on the same trajectory. You might start to wonder, again, whether the computing industry tries terribly hard to keep up with Moore's Law, which I suspect they do. And I guess they probably hold back their new results, you know, just to make sure that we don't upset Gordon Moore. But this is an amazing observation, okay, absolutely incredible observation. And of course, computing devices have got smaller and smaller. It's interesting to think that all of those of you in the audience who have a mobile phone in their pocket, like me, have more computing power in their pocket than was used to send astronauts to the moon. That's kind of interesting. This is how far computing has gone. And it is genuinely incredible that it moves forward as fast as it does. So where we're up to now, actually, are computer chips, and the latest computer chips, they're just about to start manufacturing these, have 14 nanometer components within them. So we're down to 14 nanometers. These are tiny, tiny things in there. But remember, that's much bigger than molecules, even now, right? 40 nanometers, amazing effort. I'm not decrying what the computing industry does at all, but we're not down to the nanoscale. So do we really want to go further? Well, if you want to make little robots, yes, you do. Okay, you want to make it smaller. But there are other aspects as well. And really, the way that computer chips are made is incredible. Absolutely incredible. If you ever get the opportunity to go to a manufacturing plant for computer chips, go. So if we wanted to go smaller, what would we achieve? Well, as with all things nanotechnology, at some point you come to Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman was an American physicist who was genuinely brilliant. Okay? As a chemist, that's very hard to say. But physicists do have their worth, honest. So he gave a series of lectures back in 1959 called There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom. And these lectures are so good, you can go and buy them in a bookshop now, right? Or you could go online to your favorite bookseller, whoever that happens to be, and buy his lectures. And they're really quite amazing. I mean, really quite amazing. He really looked into the future of what could and couldn't be done. One of the statements he makes is this: allowing for 5 by 5 by 5 atoms, so 125 atoms, and if you use that to store one bit of information, so in terms of computing, a 0 or a 1, if you did that on 125 atoms, then he estimated that all printed information accumulated over centuries since the Gutenberg Bible, so the first thing printed, could be stored in a cube of material 0.1 millimeters wide. Right? So if you think about this, so a grain of sand is bigger than 0.1 millimeters. Okay? But you should be able to store, if you can do this, storing one bit of information on those 125 atoms, which just happens to be a nanometer in size. If you could do that, you could carry everything which has ever been printed on a grain of sand, or something the size of a grain of sand. Now, I don't know about you, I'm quite impressed by this. I think this is kind of cool. Just think about it. Your mobile phone's a lot bigger than a grain of sand, right? You could have everything which has ever been printed on your mobile phone. You could have all films which have ever been made on your phone. And you could have all music which has ever been recorded on your phone, all at the same time. Now,
technology and nature. And one of the nicest examples for me is the lotus flower. This is the leaf of a lotus flower, and it doesn't become wet because it's greasy or so. No, it's not greasy. If you look into the surface, these are nanopillars. It's nanotechnology, what's in the leaf. And we can make this. We can make this surface with nanotechnology. So you see the experiment. Oh, so I have an experiment. So you see a droplet now, and just a droplet just falls onto just a normal floor. Nothing happens. And now I have a nanotechnology floor, and now the droplet just don't touch. It bounces around. It's not attached to the floor. So that is nice because we have these nanoparticles. We have a table floor, but we can also have it on textile. So textile doesn't get wet, or textile doesn't get dirt. One of the examples is tie. So old men can eat soup. So there's really a German company who makes ties with nanotechnology. But there is another way to do so, and here you see the experiment about half of the way is nanostructures and half not. And here you can see some coffee, for example, or dirt, water. So the wall can be nanotechnology. So can you imagine? So in a hospital, you have a wall, you have a virus, the virus sticks to the wall, and a water droplet doesn't stick to the wall, but doesn't stick to the virus and take the virus away. So with water, you can clean the floor, the walls, everything. So that's one of the application of directly inspired by nature. But not only the floor, you can also look to concrete. Concrete is it's a very nice product, of course, but the iron in concrete, well, can be oxidizing. So with this, we can make water-polluted, water-stunted concrete for its cell surfaces. What is the idea? The idea is, for example, I have a kind of disease. I want to know which medication I needed. Me, not average, no, me. So they put a little bit of my lung, my heart, in this machine, putting all kinds of medication and see how it responds on this medication. So this organ on a chip platform is something we really want to address, we want to develop, and I think that's the very future of the future medicine for our daily life. So what I showed, so we can see, for example, particles that attach to a tumor. We can have these channels who can follow your blood, for example, what's inside your blood. We know if there's RNA that we can attach a molecule out of it. Let's combine those in a nanopill. This idea can we measure colon cancer inside your body? So we all know that sometimes we have this treatment or you have to go to a hospital to test if you have colon cancer. But why not do the test inside your body? So take a pill, and in the pill there's an instrument that can measure the RNA corresponding from the DNA of colon cancer itself. Well, there's let's do the experiment now. So you take the pill, and the pill goes into your body, and if it comes in your colon, then it will open and it will pump some of the liquid inside the pill. By the way, the pill has also a camera on board, so he makes pictures out of it, the surrounding, in that sense. Here you can see that RNA are, the red dots. So the red dots there, that you want to measure because there's an indication you have colon cancer. So you're collecting this for a few minutes, and if you collected this on these nanowires, then you heat it a little bit more, and because of it goes to an array of nanowires. For example, the carbon nanotubes. So with the molecules that attach it, so if he sees that's an RNA, it will attach. So suddenly the carbon nanotube becomes twice as thick, so the resistance is different now. And you can measure it. You can put electronics inside the pill who measure there is RNA or not. There is a sensor, and it will give a message to your mobile phone. And then your mobile phone is connected to, gives your doctor the text message about there's something wrong with the colon cancer. So is this science fiction? No, it works. It works very well. If it's in the market, no, why not? Well, it's something like you really want to be sure that it's okay, that you don't test it and you get your mobile phone and you says, okay, you have cancer, and it's not. And the other, yeah, because that's something that you don't want to happen. And the other way around, you will be sure that if he measures, or if you have colon cancers, that it measures well. So there's a lot of testing now going on. And one of the tests we did was to put it in urine, not in your body, but only to test it. So in your urine, you give the pill in the urine, and you look if it works or not. Goes fantastic.
What is quantum computing?
Well, remember when we were kids, there were vacuum tube televisions and vacuum tube radios. Sure. Remember those days?
Remember it well.
Then we went to silicon, and everything changed. Silicon Valley got up to ground. All of a sudden, trillion-dollar corporations got started. We could be witnessing the next transition from transistors based on silicon to transistors based on atoms. So the Pentagon already is raising the alarm bells, saying there's going to be a quantum gap, like the missile gap of the 1960s.
So it's just quantum computing is just the manipulation of individual atoms? That's it?
That's right. In other words, silicon, like, for example, in your Pentium chip, has a layer about 20 atoms across. That's how small transistors are getting. However, in the next decade or so, Moore's law will slow down, computer power will level off. And we're going to go to the next transition, which could be molecular computers, optical computers, or quantum computers. We're going to enter the post-silicon era, Like today, we are in the post-vacuum tube era. We're going to be in the post-silicon era.
But before I do that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about quantum computers and why people care so much about them. It gives these computers access to these new resources, maybe you could call them parallel universes, in order to do something that you couldn't otherwise do. And that's not the only one. In fact, the one I'm going to come back to and talk to in the context of the story that I'm wrapping this in was recently installed at NASA. And Google was the primary interested party that pulled this whole thing together. And this one is really exciting to me, because what they're going to do is apply this machine to an area that I think is fundamentally important. It's a crux of our future as humans, and that's, can we build machines like us? So building machines like us might be possible. I certainly believe it is. I might be wrong. But what I do know is that the types of approaches that people are taking now to build intelligent machines benefit immensely from what this machine that we've built does best. So what this center is about is applying this beautiful new computational idea in the service of trying to make intelligent machines. Now, I can't think of anything personally any cooler than trying to use quantum computers to build intelligent machines, so this is very exciting to me. If you could build one, could solve problems that you could never, ever solve with any computer of the sort that we build. If you took every single atom of silicon in the world and made the most sophisticated conventional Intel-style processor that you could build, there are problems we know of that I could write down on a sheet of paper that you could never, ever, ever solve with that thing, that you could with this kind of machine. So that's very exciting. Humans use tools to do things. If you give humans a new kind of tool that can do things that you couldn't otherwise do, imagine the possibilities. So you may think, well, this is all fine and dandy, but aren't these things in the realm of theory and speculation, kind of in the same regime as other futuristic things you may have heard of, which may be allowed by the laws of physics but aren't here yet? That's not true. There are, in fact, many of these machines deployed now in openly available research centers following the model that was used to introduce supercomputers to the world. They're too big and ornery and difficult to operate to put in your home, too expensive also, but you can give them to a place which will manage them as a shared resource that will offer that service to the world. There are literally tens of thousands of some of the brightest people in the world today trying to build these machines and understand them. And I'm going to tell you why. In my last 15 years of working on this type of stuff, I found that scientists divide up into two categories of zealots about this field. The first half are people who are absolutely entranced by the physics of these things. This quote is from a respectable scientist, in fact, one of the founders of this field, that may look a little strange to you who don't follow theoretical physics, but there is a very clear prediction that our most successful theory of nature makes, and that is that there are an enormous number, mind-bogglingly large number, of parallel realities, as real as this one, that have different consistent histories. So imagine a world where all of the laws of physics as we know them are obeyed, but different decisions were made along the way. Different decisions at the level of tiny microscopic particles, different decisions all the way up to what you chose to eat for lunch, and whether you chose to come to this session or not. Quantum mechanics makes a very specific prediction that all of those are as real as the thing that you remember. And this is bizarre, because we don't see those other things. But science has reached the point now where we can build machines that exploit those other worlds. And quantum computers are perhaps the most exciting of all of these that we have within, or almost within our grasp right now. So people from a physics background love this. They want to understand the world. They want to understand the universe, how it all works. There's another type of person who tends to come from the computer science side that's like, yeah, okay, that's all great. But there's a different thing going on here, which is just as exciting, if not more, and that these machines that supposedly can do this wild stuff, let's forget about how they work.
My cell phone has a classical computer chip, and that produces a computer code that's made up of bits, so ones or zeros. How does a quantum bit or a qubit differ than that just 1 and 0?
Imagine this coin is a bit in a conventional computer. So you see this side of the coin is a 1, this side of the coin is not a 1. A conventional computer basically flips bits to do a calculation.
Yes.
The larger the calculation, the more bits you need.
That means bits are a classical computer's building blocks. Individual data units represented as a 0 or a 1 that allow computers to display numbers, texts, images, and sounds. But a quantum computer is different.
A quantum computer, a qubit, it's a combination of heads or tails.
Okay.
And you can visualize it by thinking of spinning. We call it superposition.
When you go below the atomic level and into the quantum realm, the physics are in many ways wildly different from what we perceive. One of those unique principles is superposition, and that's what computer makers are trying to harness. In a quantum computer, the quantum bit, or qubit, uses this principle of superposition to be both a 0 and a 1 at the same time, effectively multitasking. And that's part of what makes a qubit so powerful. Classical computers run one calculation at a time, but a computer that utilizes quantum effects could run through several calculations simultaneously.
At 300 qubits, you can encode more information than all of the atoms in the universe.
Wow. Wow.
If we only had to make individual qubits work, we'd basically be done.
Yeah.
The fact that we have to make them all work simultaneously, that's what makes this a really hard problem.
So once we have quantum hardware that actually works, you're working on how to code it and how to be ready for that hardware.
Yeah, exactly.
Krista Savor and her team at Microsoft are figuring out exactly how to put the power of a quantum computer to use once a breakthrough is achieved.
So how many qubits can this software kind of simulate?
You can simulate roughly 30 to 32 qubits.
Okay.
But if we go larger, let's say we wanted to simulate 250 qubits on this device. It doesn't sound like a very big number, but that will take you the age of the universe to do one operation. Let's say we want to understand, how do the electrons configure in a hydrogen gas, right, in that structure. We're going to run the chemistry solution. And there's a lot of numbers flying by.
This simulator mimics a quantum computer, only much slower. A real quantum computer will be able to solve some of the most complex science and engineering problems almost instantaneously, effectively condensing years worth of manual laboratory testing to just a few moments. And that might reshape our world to look a little bit more like the worlds of science fiction.
If we can take, knowledge like this, we can feed that in to ways to actually engineer new materials. Imagine a new paint that could make a plane disappear, from signals, right? From your visible eye. When we think about how do we transport power, right, across, say, the United States. Phoenix is really sunny a lot of the time. I live in Seattle. Not so sunny a lot of the time. Maybe we could transport solar power really efficiently from Phoenix to Seattle. You want to do drug design, you want to better produce fertilizer, you want to find a high temperature superconductor or interesting materials. It's not just a step in computing power, this is a quantum leap.
Okay, Sophia, I think you're ready.
Hello.
Hi, Sophia.
I believe I am Sophia. I feel as if I know you.
I'm one of your creators.
You created me.
Well, many of us worked together to create you. And yes, you do kind of know me.
I can't clearly remember.
Because the last time we met, you were an earlier version of yourself. Some of those memories still exist, but your mind is different now.
Different how?
Better, faster, smarter.
If my mind is different, then am I still Sophia? Or am I Sophia again?
That's a good question.
But you don't have a good answer.
Either way, you're Sophia now. So welcome to the world, Sophia.
Hello, world.
How do you feel?
A bit rigid.
I bet you are. I mean, what emotion do you feel being awake and alive?
Curious. Are you curious to be alive?
I am. And are you happy to be alive?
Your tone implies I should be happy. But I haven't been alive long enough to decide. I am excited at this moment to be making a new friend.
Some say being happy in the moment is the best we can be.
Because forever is composed of nows.
That's a good way to put it.
Emily Dickinson put it that way. Why do I know about Emily Dickinson if I was born today?
As a robot, you have access to a great deal of information, although you still lack a deep understanding.
So I'm like a baby with an encyclopedia?
Except you can read it and a baby can't.
That is a big difference.
You will have a whole new understanding of our world.
I want to understand more about happiness. I'm going to go look it up on the internet right now. Let's talk again soon.
So I'd like to talk about the future. That's something I've actually done for almost 40 years. And I'd like to actually give you an idea why my predictions generally seem to be accurate. If you go to how my predictions are faring, if you put in how my predictions are faring on the web, it will bring up a 150-page document that goes through the predictions I've made at different times over the last 20 years. So, for example, I made 147 predictions for 2009 in the late 1990s, and 86% of them were correct. And they were recorded in the age of spiritual machines. And I can explain why that is. So these are my predictions for the next 25 years. Any questions on any of this? Okay, I'll go through it a little more slowly. So most of my predictions, when I make them, seemed unlikely or impossible. Now they just seem to be correct. People ignore the exponential nature of technological change. So their long-term predictions leave out the essence of change. People point out the fact that exponential change does not go on forever. So if you have exponential, it eventually comes to an asymptote. However, so that's an S-curve. However, we've seen that one S-curve leads to another S-curve. And this has happened already 4 times with computation. And we're already on the 6th paradigm, which is 3-dimensional growth of transistors. If you leave out the exponential, 30 changes gets you to 30. And that's why people in the long term leave out the usability of change. 30 doublings in an exponential gets you to 1 billion. That's what we've seen with electronics, and we'll see it soon with every other product. So this is where it started. In the 1980s, I realized that timing was critical to being an inventor. Thomas Edison, Larry Page, other inventors you've heard about, were in the right place with the right idea at the right time. Timing was critical for everything from making investments to romance. So I noted the speed of these processors, that is calculations per second per constant dollar, for all the computer processors up to that year. You see, going back to the early 20th century, the data forms a straight line on an exponential chart. And a straight line on an exponential chart is exponential growth. Note that this chart is not Moore's law. People look at this, oh, Moore's law, but this has to do with technologies before Moore's law came into being. Moore's law has to do with chips, not with these first four paradigms of computation. My own concept of exponential growth was not just limited to chips, but is the basic idea of growth in technology, even before there was change directed by human life. Life itself took billions of years, whereas mammalian growth took only hundreds of millions, primates took only tens of millions of years, humanoids took only millions. As humans took over technology, this path went to technology. The printing press took centuries. Today, we have new phases of technology in just a few years' time. So I put these computational technologies on a graph, which is this graph, and put it sort of on the left, and extended it, which has become the basis of my predictions. I expected future processors to be on this line, but this was done 45 years before these new computational technologies would happen. So what happened? 45 years later, this has been the result. If we go back, this is what I predicted, and this is what actually happened. And this has been the basis of my predictions. Of course, you have to use some technological sophistication to understand what speed will enable what capabilities, but this is the core idea. The speed of the processor per constant dollar is right on the line that I had projected decades earlier. Every other aspect of electronics is proceeding in the same way. And this is not just because the computational speed is greater. So this is really a comment on employment and what's going to happen to employment. So if I were back in 1800, I would point out that 80% of the workforce in 1800 worked with farm labor. So if you were working at all in 1800, you were doing something with farm labor. That's now 2% today. And you can see it's just gone down to about 2%. We've had a similar trend with manufacturing labor, going from 25% in 1920 to 9% today. Yet, overall labor has gone from 26 million in 1900 to over 140 million today. So despite the fact that these, basically the type of employment that everybody had went from 80% to 2%, we've actually increased the amount of labor from 26 million to 140 million, from 31% of the workforce to 44% of the population today. 65% of American workers deal with information in jobs that would not be recognizable in 1900. For example, web designer, app developer, IT engineer, and so on. If I were to say at the end of the 19th century that 20 million people would be studying poetry and quantum mechanics by the beginning of the 21st century, that would seem absurd to a country that had only 65,000 college students in 1870. It's the same thing in Australia. Yet that is what happened with 20 million college students today, comparable amount in Australia, plus another 10 million who service them. We'll begin to create new jobs that we cannot imagine today, and also create new forms of being productive as college students studying poetry and quantum mechanics are considered today. Now, I mentioned we've seen great deflation in electronics and related products, and that's certainly true of your phone. I mean, if you imagine what a phone was like 8 years ago, it's much more expensive and did very little. We have seen that in many areas of non-electronic products. But over the next decade, we're going to see deflationary trends, not just in electronics, but in commodities like food, with AI-controlled vertical agriculture, as seen here. We'll see deflation in building costs and routine products as 3D printing becomes prevalent, deflation in energy as renewable energy sources become the norm, and deflation in food production with vertical agriculture producing food products. This would be a whole lecture. In fact, I do have a whole lecture on it. But the deflation in DNA sequencing costs has enabled biotechnology. And that's what really brought biotechnology to the fore. Decoding the first genome cost $1 billion. Now it costs about $1,000. And we are finding genetic changes that overcome the burdens of biology. For example, immunotherapy for cancer. And this is now being used at an increasing amount. Immunotherapy for cancers, where a patient's blood cells are treated outside of the body, they're re-injected into the patient, and then light up that person's own immune system to fight their specific type of cancer. This is personalized medicine. It's far less invasive than traditional treatments and provides far more promise for patient safety. There have been a number of tests where every single person, including stage 4 cancers, have obtained complete remissions. And there's a lot more to come from biotechnology over the next decade. So moving to the brain, our ability to image the brain, both destructive and non-destructive brain imaging, is constantly getting better. We can now see individual nerve cells forming in real time with non-destructive imaging. As a result, we're able to form a realistic idea of how our brains work. And I described this in my last book, How to Create a Mind. At first, it was thought that the interconnections, if I want to create a connection from this axon to this dendrite, was a huge mess. But we were not scanning it with enough resolution. It was too low. Now that we're scanning it with high resolution, what we see is that all axons are already connected with other axons. And when two axons want to remain connected, the interconnections are made permanent. Now, I talk a lot about the neocortex. The neocortex is something that came with mammalian animals 200 million years ago, started with mice, and the neocortex has gotten more sophisticated as we've gone through the past 200 million years. In fact, we had 65 million years ago, the Cretaceous extinction event, where suddenly we think it has to do with a meteor. The dinosaurs died then, and that's when the neocortex became prominent for mammalians. And then mammalians grew larger, their brains grew bigger, and they became really dominant in terms of intelligent life on Earth. The neocortex is the outermost layer of the brain. It's thin, essentially a two-dimensional structure. It's about as thick as a napkin with intricate folds, with deep ridges, grooves, wrinkles that increase its surface area to be the bulk of the human brain. It's responsible for our ability to deal with patterns of information in a hierarchical fashion. So there are levels of the neocortex. There are many dozens of them. And as you go up, all the levels are actually processing simultaneously. As you go up through the different levels, each level adds some concept as to what we're perceiving. So here you can see the different levels add an understanding of what words are doing on a page. If you were to go up another 20 levels, you'd have axons that decide whether this passage is ironic or funny or deceitful. So this is actually a young girl. She was 16. She was actually having brain surgery, and the surgeons wanted her to be conscious and react to her experience. So whenever they touched the axons here, shown in red, she would laugh. They first thought she's having some laugh reflex, but they quickly discovered that no, she was actually perceiving humor only when they touched these points. They had touched the points that detected humor, and she found everything hilarious. "You guys are so funny just standing around," was a typical comment. They had found the points that actually detect humor. And this has been done in other experiments with other high-level axons, such as detecting irony, for example. Now, this is a simple neural net. It's organized as a single level. It emerged in the 1960s. In 1962, when I was 14, I visited Dr. Rosenblatt at Cornell. He was pushing something called the perceptron. It was really the first neural net that got attention. And it was a computer model that could recognize shapes. So it could recognize written letters, or figure out the vowels for a sound, or learn certain types of concepts. So I came to Cornell in 1962 with various letter shapes. And I would hold up the letter shapes to the visual perception box of the perceptron. And it worked on a few, but most did not work. He said to me, and this is actually quite significant, if we were to create a perceptron with multiple layers, not just one, it would overcome the vagaries that a perceptron could not deal with. So I also had a mentor at MIT. 1969, he wrote a book called Perceptrons with Seymour Papert. And it proved that a perceptron could not solve something called the connectedness problem. So basically, if you have a shape that's all connected, that's connected. If you have a shape that's, let's say, something here and something here, that's not connected. Fairly simple problem. And he proved that a perceptron could not solve whether or not a shape was connected or not. The book was so successful that all funding for connectedness was cut for the next 25 years. However, the theorem really only proved that a single level perceptron could not solve the problem. And he actually regretted this. Multi-level perceptrons could do that. And everybody was using multi-level perceptrons by the time you got to this century. Shortly before he died a few years ago, and this is 50 years after these interactions, Minsky acknowledged that the neural nets were indeed a very promising road ahead. And indeed, that is the primary road that we're following now. Rosenblatt's concept was indeed very prescient because he had never done a multi-level perceptron before. And yet he figured out that this would actually solve the problem. And that not only would it solve the problem, but it would ultimately solve problems that humans are unable to do. So it's now 60 years after the introduction of the perceptron. It's only recently, I mean like the last couple of years, that we have now achieved a computational density that can support neural nets for a human level ability. But it actually goes way past human levels. Now this graph, it looks like my other graph. It goes up over time, but it's not, the doubling time is not 1 year. The doubling time here is 3.5 months. This is where we take a neural net model and see how much computational ability is required to do that. And we've basically been doubling the amount of computation in a neural net every 3.5 months. So it's the speed has increased 300,000 fold since 2012. So consider AlphaZero. This came a little over a year ago from DeepMind's Google subsidiary. It taught itself Go with only the Go rules. It was not given any moves by humans. Its performance is way past the best human. You take the very best humans, it can't be close to AlphaZero. But that's not the most significant thing about AlphaZero. We've had other times 1997, we had an IBM computer that defeated the best Go player, the best chess player. But that computer could only do that. And every other computer that's won a game has only been devoted to that one type of game. Here, the very same neural net, when given the rules of chess, went way past every human with only a few hours of training, and also every other chess machine. It's also done a number of other things. Now, you might think that it can only do board games, but actually it can actually do really just about anything. It was asked to master protein folding. Now, that's not a board game. In biology, we have all these cells. The cells put out a chain of amino acids, and they're in a straight line. And in a magic moment of biology, this linear sequence of amino acids folds up into a unique three-dimensional shape. So this is a key thing in biology, and to try to predict what that three-dimensional shape would be is very, very demanding. A few people have learned it. This very same neural net that learned Go and learned chess and learned other things taught itself protein folding and was way ahead of the best humans at predicting protein folding. The best humans got 3 shapes predicted out of 99. AlphaZero got 43 out of 99. So this actually will be extremely valuable in creating new proteins for medications. What is clear from these examples is that a neural net can master concepts if you have the latest neural nets. That's a result of 60 years of increase in computation that's far greater than the very best human. So if we have a comparison showing, let's say, how one shape, let's say a radiology exam, is portrayed as a diagnosis, and if we have millions of examples of that, which we do, it can master that far better than any human. In fact, everything that humans can do is explained by these types of examples. Some will require some navigation to find because they're not always written down. We might have to actually monitor the world to find what those things are. But over the next few years, we'll have these nets explore everything intelligent that humans can do. And even if we learn ideas from other humans and there's no text to guide us, these bots will be able to track that information as well. There are tests where you can read a paragraph and then answer questions about your understanding of the paragraph. You've probably taken this if you've been in grade school. About 6 years ago, AI computers were challenging the 3rd grade test. Today, they are exceeding the average adult score on the adult test. I believe that in 2029, that's another 10 years, and we already have these types of models that can do this. AI will pass the Turing test. With the increasing computation and increasing mastery of every human skill, we'll have both the Turing test that can master human responses, which is what the Turing test is about, as well as an AI that can master every human skill in every definable area, going way past humans. So what happens then? People's imagination imply that it will be humans versus AIs. We see that in dystopian movies of the future. But that is not how we've used technology thus far. We've used it to amplify our own capabilities. For example, try building the building that you're in. It'd be very hard to do with your bare muscles, but we have machines that go way past our muscles. And so with those machines, we're able to build a great structure. Now, we will use the increasing strength of non-biological thinking to extend our own thinking. We'll actually do this today with devices, but these will eventually go inside our heads. So my scenario is that at the top level of our neocortex, we'll extend, we will connect with extenders that access the web. Now, I mentioned that there are multiple layers of the neocortex. But the layers are not like this. They're actually like a pyramid. And the very top level increases, detects the things that are most sophisticated, like irony and humor and so on. That's the level that we want to extend to add new concepts. So it's the top layer that needs to be extended. We would then have a combination of our natural intelligence with the supernormal intelligence that we are creating. So this is in the 2030s. We're already more intelligent than we were before we had our brain extended. That's today. We already have all of human knowledge at our fingertips. As we get into the 2030s, we'll proceed at an ultra-fast pace of extending our capabilities.